Resistance Fall of Man was one of the launch games of the PlayStation 3, and if you remember how challenging the launch of that system was, full of great games wasn't really a perfect description of those first few months. Sure, Call of Duty 3 and Ridge Racer 7 were solid choices, but if you were looking for a game to play on your brand new PS3 in November 2006, chances are Resistance Fall of Man was your pick. For many, it was the obvious choice, and even though Insomniac has since abandoned the series, leaving it as a distant memory in PlayStation's history, a lot of people still fondly remember the great time they had with it. But our nostalgia and even the circumstances under which we experience a game, like it being a launch title, can be deceiving. So is Resistance Fall of Man as good as you remember? Let's find out. And I say chances are you probably picked Resistance Fall of Man because the marketing for this game was incredibly strong. From various TV ads, trailers, and websites to those striking marketing posters that still stick with me today, it was everywhere. Combine that with all the hype for the PS3 and Insomniac riding high after the success of Spyro and Ratchet & Clank, and Resistance certainly carried a lot of expectations. And it delivered. It was incredibly well received, both critically and commercially. By 2007, it had sold over 2.1 million copies. Reviews at the time praised its visuals, gameplay, and multiplayer options, making it one of the highest rated launch titles. It featured creative guns, next-gen graphics, and a dark atmosphere, a common trend of that era as games aimed to be seen as a more mature entertainment. And now that I've finally gotten myself a PS Triple, I want to revisit the system's library. Since I was on the other side of the fence back then, I believe there's no better place to start than with one of its launch titles. So let's take a look back at Resistance Fall of Man and see if it aged like fine wine or if it's perhaps not as good as you recall. And before we begin, be advised, this video will have spoilers. Resistance Fall of Man is set in the 1950s, but with a twist. It's not just another World War II shooter. Instead, reality took a different path. An alien race known as the Chimera arrived in Russia in the early 1900s. With their advanced technology, the Chimera infected a large portion of the population and used them to build their army. By 1949, mainland Europe had fallen to the Chimera, with England as their next target. Up until that point, the US, comfortably on the other side of the Atlantic, remained neutral, staying out of the conflict. But in 1951, they decided to send a task force to help the UK, and that's when we step into the shoes of Sergeant Nathan Hill. Hill was just an ordinary soldier at the beginning of the war, but things were about to take an unexpected turn. He and his squad are ambushed by enemy troops, who infect them with the Chimeran virus. Hill, the only survivor, discovers he has an innate resistance to full infection. The story is told by British Captain Rachel Parker, whom we rescue from a Chimeran conversion center before making our own escape. With his newly acquired recharging health and, well, resistance, Hill plows through. Even if there's always a doubt about whether he's more human or a chimera, given the desperate circumstances, any help is welcome. By assisting British Lieutenant Stephen Cartwright, we uncover a crucial detail. The Chimera have established a series of towers throughout England, interconnected by underground power conduits. What's even more puzzling, these towers weren't built but were, in fact, excavated from the ground. Through his unique connection to the Chimera, Hill learns that these towers are actively altering Earth's climate. He comes to the grim conclusion that destroying the Central Tower in London will somehow result in the total defeat of the Chimera in Britain. British and American forces then launch a desperate assault on the Central Tower. Hill manages to breach the tower and destroy its power core, triggering a massive explosion. Hill is subsequently presumed to have been killed in the destruction, with the US Army officially listing him as killed in action. Parker, however, isn't convinced, believing he's still alive. Turns out she was right. In a post-credit scene, we learn that Hale is indeed alive. His luck seems to be running out though, and a squad of unknown soldiers detains him. And that is of course our segue to the sequel. In addition to the main narrative, throughout each level you can find multiple intel documents. These scattered pieces of information give you a valuable insight into what has happened, what is currently happening, and what might happen next. It may not be the greatest story ever told in an FPS game, but this twist of a World War II era setting with an alien invasion gives the game a unique feel, with an atmosphere to match. The protagonist isn't a Marcus Phoenix or Master Chief though. My main problem with the story is that it drags on for way too long. The events told in the campaign take place from July 11th to July 14th, just a few days. One would think that it would lead to a 4 or 5 hour campaign. Instead, it takes about 8 to 10 hours. Not only that, but the campaign is split into more than 30 chapters, each with a small cutscene. This heavily fragments the story, dragging it on longer than it should and taking away part of its impact. Resistance Fall of Man plays much closer to a PS2 game than to what we've come to expect from 7th gen shooters, which is somewhat expected for a launch title. If I had to summarize Resistance gameplay in the fewest words, it would be lots of enemies. You could imagine that Sony probably asked Insomniac to showcase the power of the PS3, and filling it with as many enemies as possible was certainly one way to do this. Some might argue that it works to oppress the player and make you feel like you're fighting an unstoppable force, but gameplay-wise it does feel artificial. And given that you're often put in scenarios with limited cover or can easily get stuck on the geometry with rooms constantly filling with enemy troops, it gets frustrating pretty fast. As if it couldn't get worse, the checkpoint system is awful. Sometimes you play for 10 or 15 minutes fighting a barrage of enemies without seeing the checkpoint reached text once on screen. Again, this is a 2006 game, and checkpoints were pretty hit or miss back then, but it makes certain deaths feel almost rage-inducing. And the final stretch of the game can be infuriating. I was not having fun in some of those missions and boss fights. At least the vehicle segments are fun and a great change of pace. I sort of wish they would be more frequent. And after you get infected by the Chimeran virus, you gain the ability to recover your health automatically, but it's not so straightforward. You have 4 health bars and you're only able to auto-recover your current one, meaning you also have to rely on health packs. These adds a certain layer of strategy, forcing you to be more careful, which is useful considering the sheer number of enemies. However, given that you're often overwhelmed with enemy troops, it leads to some deaths that just feel cheap. Resistance Fall of Man is also one of those games that does a terrible job of showing you the damage you're taking. I'm pretty sure a good portion of my deaths in this game happened because I had no idea I was so close of being taken out, as the game wouldn't show it to me. Contrast this with, say, Gears of War, which even without a health bar consistently present, clearly shows you when you're in danger and need to be more careful. In Resistance, make sure to keep looking at your health bar in the corner of the screen. Of course, some of these issues could be alleviated if the controls were excellent. Sadly, but also expectedly, the movement is a bit janky and the default controls aren't your standard Call of Duty key maps. For instance, by default you shoot on R1, crouch on L2 and aim down sights on R3. Fortunately, and this is a big plus, you can remap everything. This is a great way to ensure that even if control standards change, your game can still be somewhat future-proof in that regard. What it doesn't change though is the overall jankiness of your moves. Aiming down sights works as a toggle, so you can't just hold it to aim more precisely and then release it to move or aim from the hip. You have to toggle it on and off. Crouching, on the other hand, doesn't work as a toggle, and you have to hold the button to take cover or lower your profile. And I was curious to see how this game would implement the 6-axis gimmicks, functionalities, as it was released when Sony was still trying to push it as the future of controls. Fortunately, it doesn't get in the way. You're asked to shake your controller if an enemy gets a hold of you, but that's pretty much it. Now, being a game developed by Insomniac, one has to expect that the arsenal, the guns available, will be fun to use. Fortunately, that's exactly the case. The game brings a mix of human weapons, both common and high-tech/secret and alien ones, and every gun has a main fire mode and an alternate one. The alien guns, at least to me, ended up being the more interesting ones. They allow the developers to be more creative. The weapon I used the most was the Bullseye, the main battle rifle of the Chimeran troops. Its secondary fire shoots a homing tag that can be quite useful, allowing you to stay in cover. The Auger rifle is perhaps the most interesting, firing penetrating rounds that will pass through walls and other objects. It can also deploy a barrier which blocks all weapon fire except its own. However, ammo for the Auger is hard to find. As for human weapons, your time-tested shotgun is always fun to use, as is your trusted standard issue rifle that can launch grenades as its alternate fire mode. The highlight perhaps is the XR005 Hailstorm, which despite being named like a printer, shoots ricocheting bullets and has a turret as its secondary fire mode. You also have a sniper rifle, a sticky mine, a rocket launcher, and an enhanced Bullseye, which is probably the best weapon in the game. On your second playthrough, you'll be able to unlock a few extra ones as well. And given that you can carry all weapons at once, it gives you a layer of strategy to choose which weapon best suits each situation. Unfortunately, chances are you never have enough ammo for the weapons you like the most, and certain weapons like the sticky mines and the shotgun end up not being as useful as they could have been. As a next-gen launch game, visuals are quite important, and I'd say with one major caveat, Resistance Fall of Man does quite well, even nearly 20 years later. If I try to put myself back in the shoes of a 14-year-old Critical Pixels, I would have been impressed by how this game looks. It looks clear enough in motion, and you have different areas, from the Manchester Cathedral to the insides of a bunker and alien excavation sites, to the countryside in Somerset and even the streets of London. What makes the game less appealing than it could be is the color palette. It feels like Resistance tries to use every kind of brown, gray, and black perceivable to the human eye. Again, this wasn't unique to Resistance. The 7th gen would be filled with desaturated games, but Fall of Man is one of the most glaring examples. What surprised me though is how well this game runs. Given how common performance issues are on the PS3 and the fact that this is a launch title, I was expecting frame drops and plenty of screen tearing. To my surprise, Resistance Fall of Man runs exceptionally well. Finally, when it comes to ambience and enemy types and variety, it's a bit of a mixed bag. I mentioned the dark color palette a while back, and one direct issue it brings to gameplay is that enemies are hard to see. They blend in pretty much everywhere, and at times it's hard to tell where you're being shot from. But the overall atmosphere and vibe are really great, probably the strongest point. You'll be exploring bunkers, tunnels, and the streets of the UK and the countryside. The variety is good, and the mood can be quite spooky. I certainly had a few jump scares with certain enemies, particularly the Greyjack and Howler. The enemy variety does get a bit better throughout the campaign, but it often feels like you're fighting against the same grunts over and over. Even the incredibly annoying Leaper is used often. Once again, part of the blame is on their color palette. Most of the enemies are predominantly black, brown, and gray, so in the middle of all the chaos and flying bullets, it's even hard to differentiate the different types of enemies. The sound design is great, although some weapons might leave something to be desired. Explosions, blasts, enemies' grunts, and the screams of doors and hallways are all well captured. Overall, it has good visuals for the time, some of the weapons are fun to use, and the story is interesting enough. But the cheap difficulty due to the sheer number of enemies, the junky controls, the level design, and the bad checkpoint system keep getting in the way of it being a truly great game, at least for me. But for a launch title, Resistance had one main goal: to be a proper next-generation shooter on a Sony console. If we can give one major criticism to the incredible PS2 library, it's certainly its lack of great FPS games. As we move to a new generation, especially with Halo playing such an important role on the other side of the fence, that's what fans were starving for. And I'd say Resistance Fall of Man mostly achieves that. Resistance delivered on some of the expectations for a next-gen shooter. It had a higher resolution, great visuals for the time, a good selection of weapons, a long campaign, and a great multiplayer mode. And at a time when the PlayStation 3 was in need of a win after its launch price scared many people away, it was a solid launch option. And I'm sure the comment section will be filled with recollections from those who played it at the time and spent countless hours on the campaign, both single player and co-op, and of course, the multiplayer. And even beyond that, further proof of its success is that Resistance was popular enough to warrant a sequel, which would arrive just 2 years later. Taking a look at Resistance Fall of Man all these years later was certainly interesting. And if you love this game, I'm not trying to erase your memories or anything like that, but nostalgia and timing certainly play an important role. It's hard to believe this game would have received the same critical and fan acclaim had it not been a launch title. It didn't reinvent or push the genre forward. It had level design and difficulty issues, janky controls, bad enemy variety, and a campaign that drags on way longer than it should, and a color palette that almost gets in the way of the gameplay. But it has values, if nothing else, almost as a time capsule, a snapshot of the games of that era. More than that, it had a great atmosphere, an interesting premise, and some creative and fun to use weapons, as well as its multiplayer. It was very much an FPS of its time, and if anything, more of a PS2 FPS than what shooters would become during the 7th generation. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's something comforting and appealing about games that just try to do the basics. But it also means they might age badly, and they don't necessarily push the genre forward. And I'd say it was certainly interesting checking it out, and now I feel like I owe it to myself to play the rest of the series. And I'll play the second one and make a video on it soon, so make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more. As always, thanks for watching, have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video.